This morning we're in an early JK with an LS engine, and I'm not exactly sure what engine it is. I thought it was a 6-liter when I was going to go on the test drive, but then I opened the hood and I noticed that it has an aluminum block. So it's not an iron block L96. It could be a 5.3, but I don't think so because it's got too much power. So this is going to be an LS 6.2 in my opinion. There's a lot of confusion about the LS 6.2 and its variations. And we're selling a lot of the LS kits, so I want to kind of go over these different configurations. We've talked about it many times over the years, but more and more guys are getting into doing these LS swaps. So it's not like the Hemis where you got the truck and the this and the that and all these different variations. There's really only a handful of LS 6.2s. So let's talk about it. Now, with the Gen 3 engines, they had the 5.7 LS1. Of course, they stepped up to the 6-liter LS2, but really it was the Gen 4 truck SUV that got the first LS 6.2 engine, and that was the L92. In the mid-2000s, GM was transitioning from the Gen 3 engines to the Gen 4 engines. In 2007, the higher-end SUVs, like the Escalades and Denali's, got the LS 6.2 all-aluminum engine with the 6L80 transmission. Now, we all know that was a fantastic combination, and it has been for the last decade or longer. However, there were some caveats to those early engines. In 2007, the 6.2 was the L92. It was an all-aluminum 6.2-liter engine with variable valve timing. It did not have flex fuel, and it did not have active fuel management. Active fuel management is the 4-cylinder mode, or they used to call it the DOD, displacement on demand, but it's cylinder deactivation. The L92 was a great engine, and they used it in 2007 or 8. But there's a lot of caveats with the L92, mainly with the operating system. GM was still learning the ins and outs of the LS controllers, the E38 controller, and the T43 especially. The T43 was the transmission controller. And GM did have issues with the early controllers, just like they did with the LTs when they first came out in 14-15. Our advice is stay away from the L92 operating system. We have supported many of them throughout the years. However, why go with an operating system that is difficult to work with, requires additional work? And a couple of the things that Motec pioneered way back in 2007, and yeah, that's when we did our first LS swap, was 2007, was the 4-wheel drive low, which we had to send a proper signal so that it wasn't in a limp mode. But more importantly was the anti-theft. There is what's called a starter relay check, and the starter relay check is basically the computer looking at the starter relay to make sure that it's in place. Because if somebody wanted to steal your vehicle or hotwire it, they could pull the starter relay out and jump the starter. Well, with this starter relay check in place, it runs current through the trigger side of the relay, which tells the computer that the relay hasn't been removed. Motec worked with EFI Live to come up with a workaround for that starter relay check in engine conversions. Unfortunately, it didn't take on all of the 7 and 8 operating systems. I don't know why. I don't know the technical side of it, but there's something to do with the checksums that just wouldn't allow it. So what we have to do is then run a resistor in line in that starter relay check circuit so that the PCM thinks there's a relay in line so that the vehicle will start. Now, the vehicle will normally start even if that's not in place, but it will, about 2 seconds after you start it, it will die. So if you get a start and die on a 7 or 8 LS operating system, check that starter relay. The L92 ran the Delco MAP or MAP sensor. Pretty much by that time, everybody was switching over to the Bosch sensor, and GM also did in 2009. But in 2007 and 8, they ran the Delco system, so it was really not compatible with anything after 2008. The intake manifold was different for a couple of reasons. I mentioned that it did not have flex fuel. In 2009, when the L9H came out, and we'll talk about that engine in a minute, flex fuel became standard on the LS 6.2. Flex fuel requires more fuel flow. Alcohol requires more fuel to flow, so they had to go to a larger injector. The injectors were taller. That means that the intake is different between the L92 and the L9H and the L94. But there is an easy solution if you want to put the larger injectors on your L92, because you can get more power out of it that way. There's a lot of companies out there, and all they do is sell you some spacers to go under the fuel rail, which raise it up and allow you to run the larger injectors. So the operating system isn't compatible between the 7 and 8 and pretty much everything else. 2009 was a go-between year, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the other issues with the early operating systems was the T43 controller. GM was still learning about the 6L80, and we noticed that these transmissions take longer to learn, or the adaptives to set, and the shifting wasn't as good as the later model, just like the 14 and 15 LTs. Well, there are a couple of codes in the early T43 controller that we have to deal with that we don't normally have to deal with in everything from about 2009 up. There's some ignition circuit codes that must be removed or you'll go into a limp mode. It's not a big deal, it's just more work. You have to hook up and program your TCM. Pretty much 2009 and up, we run the TCMs just as they are. So while the L92 was a great engine, it was just more difficult to support. Now in 2009, I call that the transitional year, because 2009, GM upgraded all the hardware on the 6.2 liter, what would become basically the standard engine all the way up to 2014. They upgraded the MAP, or the manifold absolute pressure sensor, to the Bosch. They went to flex fuel, but one thing they didn't do is they didn't add active fuel management in 2009. That's the 4-cylinder mode. So they called that engine the L9H. I have an L9H in my personal JK, and it's an excellent engine. I do have a 2009 transmission, so I'm running a 2009 operating system, and that's something that's very important we'll talk about here in a minute. So the L9H added flex fuel to the L92. They upgraded the operating system and the T43 controller for a 1-year only operating system. And a lot of guys prefer the L9H over the L94 for performance because the L9H does not have active fuel management. So you don't have those AFM lifters to crunch. In 2010, GM threw everything at the 6.2. They went to the L94. The L94 got the flex fuel, it got the new operating system, it got active fuel management, and that was pretty much the standard engine from 2010 to about 2014. Some guys say 2015 they made it available. But more importantly, GM upgraded the transmission in 2010 and standardized it. Prior to that, programming the T43 was very difficult, and you had to run the engine operating system that matched the transmission operating system. You couldn't take a 2008 transmission and throw it in a 2010 engine controller and expect it to work. It didn't. Back in like 2010 and 11, Motec used the 2009 controller as a go-between. What that meant was we can make a 2009 transmission sometimes work with an L92 and sometimes with an L94 using a 2009 controller. It wasn't ideal and I don't recommend it. It's more of a problem-solving tool that we used. So the 2009 operating system was somewhat of a bridge between the 2008 and the 2010. All of you see in my videos and posts use 2010 and up, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The starter relay check was fixed, the transmission bugs were fixed, the engine controller and the transmission controller pretty much stayed standardized for all the years after 2010. In fact, they used basically the same TCM right up to 2019 or 20 in the 6L80. So it's a very versatile operating system, and you can mix and match. You can get a 10 engine and a 12 transmission, you can get a 14 transmission and a 11 engine, it just doesn't matter. You can program these controllers and make it work. We have the L92, which is VVT, all aluminum, no flex fuel. Then the L9H, which added flex fuel to the L92 and updated the operating system to the Bosch standard, had its own TCM. Then in 2010 and up, we had the L94, which added active fuel management. And I want to mention that the L9H was still available through at least 2013, maybe 14. They didn't make nearly as many of them as they did the L94, but they are sought after now because they are non-AFM engines, which means you can rev them up higher and not damage the engine. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. If you have an L92, can you upgrade it to the late model operating system? And the answer is yes. So if you want to go with a 10 or newer transmission, which I highly recommend, you can take the L92, change the MAP sensor out so it runs the Bosch setup, and then do a couple of other small mods. The oil pressure sensor was the old large style and they tended to leak, so you're going to want to upgrade that to the small diameter oil pressure sensor. The easiest thing to do is to upgrade the injectors using the spacers to the L94. We have run the L92 injectors with the L94 operating system, but usually there's some tuning required to make them run right. And then basically that's it. You're going to run a late model operating system, harness, and transmission, and then your L92 will run just like an L9H. Can you take an L9H and upgrade it to a late model operating system? Yes, it's extremely easy because essentially it's an identical engine to the 10 and up L9H. The only difference with the L9H is the transmission and the transmission controller. So if you get an L9H from an 09 JK, it's a bolt-in in a 10 and up operating system. But you got to run that later model transmission, and that's what's critical. We had a lot of tech support 5, 6, 7 years ago because guys didn't understand the compatibility of transmissions. They thought a 6L80 was the 6L80. But you basically have three 6L80s. You have the 7 and 8, then you have the 9, then you have the 10 and up. Try to always get the 10 and up. So if you get a 10 and up 6L80, and it can be out of a Gen 5, if that's right, you can get a 16 6L80 and make it work with your 2010 5.3 or 6.0 LS. And while we're talking about that, let me give you some tech tips. If you get a Gen 5 6L80, it needs to be programmed back to a Gen 4. The best way to do that is with GM software. GM software can be a pain. Not only does everybody not have it, but it's getting more and more difficult with all the security going on to use it. So what we found was HP tuners can do a full write on a T43 TCM and pretty much change from a Gen 5 to a Gen 4. Now this works most of the time. I have seen some instances where the Gen 5 operating system won't write back to a Gen 4, but that's not very common. So using HP tuners, and by the way, we're including HP tuners in all our kits now for the LTs, and it's optional in the Gen 4. It's a very useful tool. So using HP tuners and doing a full write, you can take most of the 6L80s from 10 and up and write it to your operating system. Now a lot of you guys will bolt the 6L80 in, it came out of a 5.3 truck, you put it in your 6.0 and it works just fine and you say, oh, it's great. But we do recommend that you write it to the proper operating system so the VIN numbers match. And yes, it will work in a lot of cases, but it's just always best to have them matched. Now if you get a 6L80 out of a Camaro, and you put it in your truck, it may not work if that T43 is programmed for a passenger car. Things like tap shift and other things may not work properly, so you definitely want to program it. If you send us your T43 controller, we will program it for you. But you got to pull it out of the valve body, and that's a pain in the butt. And I want to mention, you guys that pull those T43s out of the valve body, there's two separate shift linkages. One for the internal mode switch, the IMS, and then one for the shift linkage. Make sure those both are hooked up. I get guys put these T43s back in and they call me, my vehicle won't move. And most of the time it's because they didn't hook those two linkages up. The other thing to look for is a filter. A lot of these transmissions, when you get them from wrecking yards, have the filters removed. So make sure you check that out. So a lot of you are saying, hey, when did the LS3 come out? Well, the LS3 didn't really come out in 2010. And while the LS3 is probably the most popular and sought after LS 6.2, it was the truck engines, the SUV engines that were manufactured for many years before the LS3. So what GM did is they basically took the L92 without active fuel management. They removed the VVT, variable valve timing, and they wanted to make the simplest engine they could with the LS3. The LS3 was available with a manual transmission and it was expected to rev up. Hence, they took the AFM out, they raised the compression, and there's no VVT. So they made the engine as simple as they could make it for performance. And of course the LS3 became a phenomenon, and it still is to this day, and it's a great engine. Having that higher compression and simplicity means it's great for the track, it's great for off-road racing, pretty much anything you want to do with it, the LS3 will do. Remember, the truck engines were designed to haul heavy SUVs around full of families, and they wanted good drivability. The LS3 does have a mild cam in it. GM does offer several variations with bigger cams like the 480 horse and the 525 horse. We don't recommend those because you lose drivability. But at the end of the day, the LS3 has really been a mainstay in the engine performance world for nearly a decade. There's no reason that it shouldn't be. It's basically a small block Chevy designed for modern times. It really hasn't been supplanted until the LTs came out. When the LT1 came out with 11.5 to 1 compression and 8 and 10 speed transmissions, it really changed the game. So what we're seeing now is that transition from the LS3 to the LT1. The LS3s are getting harder to get. They used to be a dime a dozen. You used to be able to call up my GM supplier, hey, send me 3 of them, and the price was good. They were in production. After GM vehicles stopped using the LS3, they continued to crank them out for GM performance, and for many years they were available. But now that the LT1 is taking over, we're finding that GM is having part supply issues, and it's just getting long in the tooth. Pretty much all the other LSs have been dropped. The 5.3s, the 6.0s. The 6.0 got dropped last year in favor of the new L8T 6.6 liter. So pretty much they're all gone now. The only one that I know of that's in production are the GM Performance engines. Now there's one more engine we want to talk about, and I just want to say there are other engines out there. There are the Gen 4 6 liters like the Holden and the VMAX, and they're all aluminum 6 liters that are kind of baby LS3s is what I call them. The L77, the L76, but we're not going to talk about those because they're somewhat obscure and rare. They put them in some of the Holden imports and police cars, and they did put some of them in the SUVs, but they were, again, far and few between compared to the engines that we're talking about. So the final engine that I want to talk about is the L99. And GM decided in the automatic transmission vehicles like the Camaros and the Corvettes, they wanted the LS3, but they wanted the technology. So the L99 is essentially the same as an L94 with the lower intake. The L99 has variable valve timing, it has active fuel management, it has flex fuel capability. So they just essentially took everything that the LS3 was lacking or missing and added it to the L99. Now, a lot of guys say that the L99 can run harder than the LS3 because it has that variable valve timing and better bottom end torque, and that may be true in a heavier vehicle especially, but you got to remember the L99 also backed the compression ratio off just like the other VVT motors, because when you have variable valve timing and you advance the cam and increase the cylinder pressure, so you got to be able to handle that, and they do that by lowering static compression. One of the great advantages of the LT is we have full control of that cylinder pressure because we have continuous variable valve timing. So you don't have to have an L99 or an LS3. With the LT1, you can have both. You can put the cam wherever you want. So they probably built more L99s than they did LS3s. And here's the deal, it doesn't really matter which LS 6.2 you have. They're all great engines for the JK. They're all aluminum, lightweight, got plenty of displacement to go up the long grades. The LS3 is slightly higher compression, but the VVT motors might have some better bottom end. My recommendation would be, if you really want to thrash it, you want to go race your Jeep, get the LS3. The L94 is an excellent highway engine for traveling and just pretty much doing anything you want. It's a great overall engine. Having the active fuel management might get you a little bit better economy, but honestly, in a heavy JK, it's not going to be much, and some guys turn it off. In that event, you might as well get the L9H, which is an excellent engine. And I want to say that the L9H and the L94 are on our California executive order, both of them, right up through 14. So if you want to get a California compliant build, you got the LS 6.2 available to you. The big question is, do you really need the 6.2? With the LS engines, the answer might be yes, because the 5.3 just isn't enough for the heavier JKs with the larger tires. The 6.0 is, and I would say that the 6.0 is a great all-around engine if you want to run regular gas. It's got plenty of power. So the LS 6.2 right now is kind of in la-la land with the introduction of the LT. A lot of guys are just flipping over to the LT. The lack of availability of the 6.2 LSs is really what's taking it out. It's not that it's not a fabulous engine. I have one in my personal JK, like I said, and I have no intention of changing it out. It's been a very good engine for me, over 80,000 miles. I think it's 90,000 miles now. And while I thought that the popularity of the LS 6.2 might fade away, we're getting more and more builder requests for them. I guess as guys are paying off their JKs and wanting to do an engine swap, and they're not wanting to do an LT because of the complexity, they're not wanting to do a Hemi because of the size and the weight, they settle on the 6.2 LS, and there's no reason not to. It's an excellent powertrain. But it's important that you understand the differences in these 6.2 LSs, especially when it comes to matching the engine to the transmission and what year your operating system is. I highly recommend that you heed our warning to stay with 2010 or newer. If you buy a 2012 L9H and then you find a smoking deal on a 7.6 L80, you're pretty much screwed. Yeah, there's things you can do to try to make it work, but it's never going to be right. So I hope this helps you guys source your 6.2 LS. We might do a similar video for the LT 6.2 because a lot of what I'm saying now applies to the LTs. We're going to take this JK to the mountain and we'll be back shortly.